We're fine. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome to Scotland Votes, the Scotland on Sunday debates. My name is Kenny Farquharson. I'm Deputy Editor of Scotland on Sunday, and I'll be your host over the next 4 weeks as we examine the issues that matter to the people of Scotland as we head into the Holyrood campaign. We're in the headquarters of the Scotsman in Scotland on Sunday today, here on Holyrood Road in Edinburgh, right across the road from the Parliament. Today's debate is being brought to you in association with Weber Shandwick and the University of the Highlands and Islands. Today, our subject is education, and we have spokespeople with us from the 4 main Scottish parties. There's one change from the advertised programme. I'm afraid Mike Russell of the SNP is ill today, so unfortunately he can't be with us. Mike, if you're watching, get well soon. In his place, we are glad to welcome Angela Constance of the SNP, the Minister for Lifelong Learning in the Scottish Government. And in today's debate, she joins Des McNulty from the Scottish Labour Party, Elizabeth Smith from the Scottish Conservative Party, and Margaret Smith from the Scottish Liberal Democrats. Can I ask you please to give them a very warm welcome? And just very briefly, today's debate will work like this, hopefully. First, each of our participants has 3 minutes to make their opening remarks. Then each of them will be quizzed by the 3 others. Then there's an opportunity for you, if you're watching at home or skiving at work, to put your questions to the politicians here today. Simply find Scotland Votes on Twitter or Facebook, send in your questions, and a selection will be put to the panel. There'll also be an opportunity for you, here our live audience, to get involved and ask questions as well. Then finally, each of our 4 participants will have 2 minutes to make some closing remarks. So, can I first invite Angela Constance of the SNP to make her opening remarks?
Thank you very much, Kenny. I am indeed rather surprised to be here. I hadn't anticipated spending a Monday afternoon in the Scotsman's beautiful building, though it is. I had anticipated spending my afternoon in my constituency in Livingston. I am, however, nonetheless delighted to be here because I believe the SNP has a record in education to be proud of. I believe it's only the SNP that has the vision for the future. And I also believe that it is the SNP that has the team to deliver on the needs for the people of Scotland. I do want to start my contribution this afternoon on a personal note, because I actually believe education is personal. The reason I have a very different life to that of my parents is because I have benefited from higher education, free higher education, and that has enabled me to succeed in my own life. And as a politician who's campaigned for free education since I was 18 years old myself, and the previous Tory government were introducing student loans at that time, I want to ensure that the next generation of young Scots that come up behind me have the same opportunities that I had the privilege and the opportunity to benefit from. I also grew up in West Lothian in the 1980s when male unemployment ran at 1 in 4. And my father was one of those unemployed men, a man that had been a worker all his days. And that has instilled in me that even within the limits of devolution and within the limits of the powers of the Scottish Parliament, that we have to do all that we can to address unemployment and, in particular, youth unemployment. And with that in mind, I'm very pleased and proud that the SNP in the recently passed budget has announced a record level of investment in modern apprenticeships, and an announcement that the SNP has followed up on by giving the commitment that over the next 4 years, that every year we will invest in 25,000 modern apprenticeships in addition to 25,000 other training places. As I said earlier, I believe the SNP has a record to be proud of. Class sizes are at a record low. Spending per head of pupils in Scotland is higher than in England. Unlike the government down south, we've retained the educational maintenance allowance. We've got a focus on the early years. 50,000 more children are receiving a free school meal, and we are, of course, delivering curriculum for excellence and making sure that curriculum for excellence is alive and well in Scotland's schools. I want to end by saying that it is the SNP that has led the debate on higher education. We have launched the Green Paper that I'm no doubt that many of you here today have participated in that debate and discussion, and I think the SNP's commitment to ensuring that we do what we can to ensure that those Scots coming behind me continue to benefit from a world-class, from a first-class higher education, and that is to the benefit of all our society. We believe that higher education benefits the society and not just the individual.
Thank you, Angela. And now can I invite Des McNulty of the Scottish Labour Party for his opening remarks.
Well, having listened to Angela, I think the reality is that the SNP are completely out of touch with what people are talking about and worried about in education in Scotland at the present time. It doesn't really matter which area you go to, which sector of education you go to. People are concerned about the cuts that are taking place, about the fact we have 3,000 fewer teachers in our schools now than we had in 2007. In the colleges, we have 10.4% budget cuts, which are meaning redundancies and significant reductions in courses. I met with a group of students on Friday from James Watt College whose computing course is under threat, and there are many people across Scotland in exactly the same position. The universities are shutting courses down, threatening redundancies, and I do think that our education is probably in the worst state that I can remember. Morale is low. I think there is a genuine concern amongst parents, not just about fewer teachers, but about less specialist support for their children, and also about what the future holds in terms of future cuts for education budgets as a result of the decisions made by the SNP government here in Holyrood and by local authorities. Labour believes in education. It believes education can be the catalyst for change for the future, and we want to make things right. It won't be an easy task to put things right, but we want to put up to 1,000 teachers into our schools to take forward literacy and numeracy. We know that as many as 1 in 5 of our young people are leaving school unable to read or write to the standard that we would like them to. We want to drive up standards, working with teachers rather than doing things to teachers, which I think has been the hallmark of this government. I believe it's mismanaged the implementation of curriculum for excellence, and that's something, again, that we want to put right. We want to tackle the issues of indiscipline within our schools and bullying, which is something I believe is completely unacceptable. And we want to address some of the funding issues and student support issues that are bedeviling further and higher education at the present time. We accept, I think, that the SNP has kept the education maintenance allowance. We want to improve on that. We want to build an education system that people can genuinely be proud of. Labour is committing to a process whereby students will not have to pay fees for higher education, and that is a commitment that we believe is right in the circumstances that we face at this particular time. We're in the midst of a recession. Young people are actually facing dire choices. There's high levels of youth unemployment. That's not something, a context in which you should think about introducing fees. But the reality is that our education system's in a mess. And Labour's project, I think one of the key projects of what we want to do for the future, is really to put it right. And just one thing I'd like to say in closing. One of the things that we think we need to address in Scotland is the kids who really don't get a chance at all. And for that, we need to focus outside the existing education system on the very, very early years, 0 to 3. We have to focus attention on what creates barriers for these children that our education system then finds it very, very difficult to overcome. We've got to put resources in there. We need to step change in that area. And that's something I'm committed to, I know Ian Gray's committed to, and I believe all of Scotland should be committed to. Thank you, Kenny.
Thank you, Des. Elizabeth.
Thank you very much. I doubt there is anybody in this room who does not believe that education is the most priceless gift that we can give to any generation. And that has to start in the early years. My party has committed to £20 million to start off a system that will lead to universal health visitors for every child from birth up to age 5, because we believe that help can be so important. We're very committed to extending the system of nursery care, of targeting youngsters, particularly from disadvantaged groups, from age 2, to extending the flexibility within nursery care, particularly to allow parents to have more flexibility in how they use their 12.5-hour entitlements, because at the moment it's a very restrictive system on the hours that they use. We're also very keen that there has to be new policies to developing parenting skills, whether that comes through traditional NHS sources or it comes through much better use of the fantastic work that is done in the voluntary sector. At primary level, I make no bones about it that we are very committed to trying to do something about improving the basic 3 Rs. We are very taken with an awful lot of the local authorities across Scotland who have managed to drive up standards, including those of the disadvantaged pupils, by homing in on traditional methods that work. And I also make no apology for the fact that I think there should be more rigorous testing of these skills before they move on into secondary school. We're very much in favour of a more flexible curriculum. Now, that will come about partly because of the changes in Curriculum for Excellence and partly because of examination reform. But it will also come about if we allow the actual curricular developments to have a slightly different structure within the school. We're keen, if pupils do not want to have a fully focused academic career in schools, to be able to leave a little bit earlier, providing they have got a very formal vocational or some kind of apprenticeship scheme ahead of them. I think that's a very important part. It will come as no surprise that we're in favour of a reform of the school system, a system that is more demand-led in terms of what parents and pupils actually really want and what teachers want, and that should open up more choice in the system. We are in favour of parents, if they so choose, or philanthropists or trusts, to be able to open new schools. But the fundamental point is that everybody in Scotland should have a good state school on their doorstep, and that, we think, can only come about through choice. And very lastly, can I just say something about higher education? Because I believe that Scotland has an distinguished history in higher education. That must be built upon. And if we want to maintain that academic excellence and our international reputation and provide for poorer students, we must find extra money in the system. That's why, and I think we'll be the only party to commit to a graduate contribution, because if we don't, we won't have that sustainability that we all need.
Thank you, Elizabeth Smith of the Scottish Conservative Party. And now lastly, not leastly, Margaret Smith for the Scottish Liberal Democrats.
Thanks very much, Kenny. Good afternoon, everybody. The Scottish Liberal Democrats set the highest store by the quality of education given to our children and to our young people. We do so because we believe in the fundamental right of all to the best start in life, whether that's support through early years or indeed continuing lifelong opportunity to learn and to develop. We believe that through education, frankly, nothing else has its power to inspire individuals and to equip people to fulfil their full potential. No one can deny that times are anything other than tough. We're living with consequences of decisions not only taken by the United Kingdom government, but also decisions in terms of education taken by the Scottish government, who have decided to take more out of education than other budget areas. But we are committed to doing all we can to maintain and enhance Scotland's educational excellence. And I would like to certainly put on record our recognition of the good work that's done in Scotland's nurseries, our schools, our colleges and our universities, because there is a great deal of good work being done. I'm proud too of the Liberal Democrat record in government in Scotland as part of the coalition with the Labour Party from '99. In terms of investment in education, we put an end also to the tuition fees which had been introduced by Labour, and then in opposition we supported the end of the graduate endowment with the present government. We are determined that the higher education funding gap will be filled, and we will work with others to maintain free education in Scotland, but we will do so not because we are led totally by the idea of free education, which we believe in, but also because we know that that gap has to be filled for us to retain the competitiveness of Scotland's higher education system. We commit ourselves also afresh to the thinking and aspiration behind Curriculum for Excellence, begun by us in government, taken forward by the present government and supported across Parliament. With the new curriculum underway and new national qualifications coming down the line, Scottish education is facing a real crossroads. Decisions taken now will shape our education system and pupil outcomes for many years to come. Some will argue for fundamental structural change of Scotland's education system. We would say that we would need evidence of the effect of that on attainment and on achievement. And if that evidence is not there, we think that what we're asking of Scotland's teachers and its education system at the moment in terms of Curriculum for Excellence and new qualifications is probably just about enough to be going on with. Excellence in education will be central to our manifesto and election priorities. We recognise that quality teachers are absolutely central to the delivery of a world-class Scottish education system. We will build on the recommendations of the Donaldson Review into teacher education, the new approach of HMIE in terms of supportive approach to working with teachers in schools, and the new role of the GTCS in terms of ongoing professional development and re-accreditation. But there are real problems, and we all know that. Since the SNP came to power, there are 3,000 less teachers working in our schools. That is a real challenge in and of itself. So it's right that discussions are now being held in terms of, do we have enough teachers? It's right too, after 10 years, we review the Macron Agreement. I think all of us would probably agree with that. Where I think there is a real sadness at the moment is that we have a parallel situation where, as well as the McCormick Review looking into Macron, what's gone right, what's gone wrong and how we move forward, we also have a situation in which there are negotiations going on which seem to be totally driven by a funding imperative. I think there is a real need to drive this forward based on the imperative of how do we deliver quality teachers and how do we deliver quality education. We're committed to working constructively with other parties, with teachers, with parents, with pupils, with higher and further education to make sure that we deliver the best possible education system from the early years all the way through life for Scotland.
Thank you, Margaret. At this point in the debate, we're going to turn our politicians on each other. Each of them will face questions from the other three. Just one single question from each of the opponents. And first to face questions will be Angela Constance. And if I can ask Des McNulty from the Labour Party to put the first question to Angela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Angela, how do you justify the fact that we have 3,000 fewer teachers in our schools now compared with what we had in 2007? And also the fact that based on budget cash cuts of 1 to 1.5% across local authorities in Scotland, we face probably the loss of a further 1,000. So it'll be 4,000 less teachers than we had in 2007 come the new term.
I think it's interesting that Des McNulty started off talking about cuts. What he's failed to tell anybody or own or acknowledge is that 2/3 of the cuts that we're currently experiencing are cuts that were delivered by the previous Labour government. And of course, you know, we're now facing, the Scottish Government is now facing cuts to its own budget of 1.3 billion. But, you know, I think it's typical of Des and his colleagues to pursue, you know, such a negative line of questioning when actually in Scotland teacher unemployment is the lowest in the United Kingdom. It is, of course, a matter of great regret that there are 300 teachers, in accordance with the figures that were released in January, that are having to claim job seekers allowance, unemployment benefit. And that's why the Scottish Government reached an agreement with COSLA, reflected in the budget just passed. The budget that's just passed is to ensure that every new teacher can indeed be employed and that teaching numbers will be preserved at around 51,000 to ensure that we can also eat into that backlog of unemployed teachers.
Thank you. And now Elizabeth Smith for the Scottish Tories to ask a question.
Angela, could I ask, the SNP, quite rightly in my opinion, has talked a lot about increasing autonomy for head teachers. Could you tell us how that sits with very rigid manifesto promises that you made in 2007 about very rigid class sizes, teacher numbers, etc.? The two, I find, don't quite sit together. Could you comment on that?
I mean, I think it is very important that head teachers have the freedom to demonstrate the leadership skills that they quite clearly have. I mean, you only have to go into any secondary school, the length and breadth of Scotland, and you see the calibre of head teachers that we have. And I think, I do believe in local autonomy. In many instances, head teachers are best equipped to make local decisions. But I don't see our arrangement with local government in such fixed terms as, of course, a partnership agreement. And I think through that adult parity of esteem partnership agreement with local government, we have indeed delivered record class sizes. So I don't actually see the two things at variance.
Margaret's question.
Yeah. The difficulty with coming last is that's the two questions I had ready for you. So the third question is curriculum for excellence and new qualifications. There's been a number of concerns raised by teaching unions and others, and there's always that sort of sense in which parents have not really been taken along in terms of this, what's described by some as a revolution in the classroom. How would you see the SNP taking parents, pupils and teachers and parents forward in terms of confidence?
I mean, I actually think, good progress has been made with the curriculum for excellence. But of course, I think Margaret's right in the sense that, parents have to be part of that partnership. And I certainly reflect on my own experience in my own constituency. And as a parent, any primary school or nursery school that I walk into is hitting you on the face with curriculum for excellence. There are, of course, with any system that involves wholesale change, people have to adapt to that change, and additional support and encouragement and understanding from government is always needed. But I think, given when you look at the international comparisons, Scotland, we're above OECD average in reading and science, and I really think, curriculum for excellence is really going to free us up and enable more of our children to reach their full potential.
Thank you. Next to take questions, Labour Party's Des McNulty, and I can ask the first question from Margaret, please, for the Liberal Democrats.
It's looking as if the SNP, the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats are ruling out graduate contribution in terms of plugging the gap in terms of higher education funding. If that's the case, how are you going to plug it?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult for every party to do this. And I think that it will involve a shift into higher education of resources from other parts of the budget. And I think that if we are going to make that commitment, all of us, then we do need to identify how that is going to be done. I mean, obviously, that'll be a matter that comes out in people's manifesto. But, if that is the shared view of three of the four political parties, then, in a sense, we are actually going to have to make that good. Now, there are different views about how big the gap is, and we heard last week that there's a range. Mike Russell really thought it came down to about £100 million, and the universities think it's £200 million. Now, there's a big difference between 100 and 200 million. And that's obviously a matter that we won't know for certain, I don't think, until June or July, when the universities in south of the border, set their fee levels, so we'll know that the size of the gap. But let's put the argument a different way. I think there's real concerns in Scotland about shifting a substantial burden of the funding of higher education onto students. I mean, I think what's happened in England is completely unacceptable, asking students to pay between £6,000 and £9,000 each year as, the price of entry into education. And in some ways, I think the fact that that has happened and that people regard it as so disastrous, and you've had such a strong reaction from students south of the border, has really sent a message to politicians here in Scotland that we need to focus on the long-term interests, not just of the young people, but I believe of Scotland, because Scotland's future rests on young people, on having very well-educated young people who actually can make the best of their opportunities. And I think the commitment that we're certainly looking to make in terms of the funding of higher education is to remove barriers from people accessing higher education. I mean, Angela talked about her own experience of going into higher education. I mean, my father was a bricklayer, and my mother worked in a factory canteen. I would never have got to university if there hadn't been a route for me to get into higher education that was supported. And I think that we have to look at what kind of support we give to students, not just in terms of whether there should be fees or graduate contribution, but also to look at issues around student support, so that the pupils and young people who are looking to get to university, who are really under financial pressure, actually get the wherewithal to take them through their courses and deliver to the best of their capacity in our future.
Thanks, Des. A question from Liz.
Des, you were on record 2 months ago, both on Newsnight and the Scottish Parliament, saying that a graduate contribution is inevitable, and you criticised the SNP for saying that they were too slow about dealing with higher education, and you're now calling for a review. Why the U-turn?
Well, I don't think I have made a U-turn at all. I mean, I think what I said, if I can recall it correctly, was that the figures that were going about at that time made a graduate contribution almost inevitable. I think that there is, we've now had some refinement of the figures, but I think we've also been listening to what people have been saying, whether that's the trade unions involved in higher education or the students themselves and the universities. And, the reality is that there seems to be a kind of sense in Scotland at the present time that we want to try to protect students from what has been imposed south of the border by the Conservative and Lib Dem government there. And I can absolutely understand that. In terms of a review, we've been calling for a review of higher education, not just of fees and funding, but of the whole, if you like, framework of higher education in Scotland for at least 18 months. And in fact, so have the Conservatives throughout the same period. I think that we've ended up putting the cart before the horse. We've actually started talking about funding before we've actually really made a proper set of decisions about what kind of higher education we want to see. And I think we actually need to have a proper look at that. We need to look at the transition between school and university, which is very clunky in Scotland. We need to look at how we best protect the very high research competitiveness of our leading universities. We need to focus on access and how we get people into university and to overcome barriers. We need to identify if there are ways in which we can actually improve the student experience, because the student experience now, as far as I'm concerned, is not as good as it could be. And the review would be intended to look at all of these issues and was always intended from our point of view to look at all of these issues so that we get a sense of what higher education system we want, how it can be best managed in the long-term interests of students and in the long-term interests in Scotland, and what kind of funding arrangements should go alongside that. That seems to me to be the rational way to go about it. But what we've had from the SNP is an unwillingness to discuss funding and therefore a brake put on every other aspect of discussion. We have a funding method that was devised in 1992. I mean, I left higher education in 1999. The basic funding methodology has not changed since 1992. There needs to be a proper look at this. And it's not just higher education. The same applies, perhaps even more so, I would argue, in relation to further education. So we need a proper review, look at it properly, say, what's the system we want? How can it be improved? How do we deliver the objectives that we want to see for Scotland? And everybody should be involved in that process. Let's widen the debate rather than narrow it purely onto funding.
And Angela's question for Des.
Thank you. Des, I'm very interested in the last policy paper that came from the Labour Party at the conference last October, which racked up 1.7 billion of new spending commitments. Now, bearing in mind that we've lost 1.3 billion from the budget, that's a black hole of 3 billion. Your most recent pledge with regards to employing more teachers would cost 30 million. I would be interested to know, does Labour have secret plans for cuts to pay for these pledges, or are their pledges not worth the paper they're written on?
Well, I'm not going to take any lessons from the SNP about pledges not worth the paper that they're written on. If I just want to go through, we'll abolish student debt, we'll reduce class sizes, we'll keep teachers at the same number that we inherited. All promises made, all promises broken by the SNP. The pledge in terms of up to 1,000 teachers is actually 24 million in the coming financial year. That's our figure for it. And we don't have a long list of uncosted promises. What we actually have is a very carefully constructed framework of policies, and we have refined these down. We're not making the same mistake as the SNP of promising things that we can't deliver. But let's be clear about what the SNP has done. They have switched money substantially out of education in order to deal with what I would call their vanity projects, whether that's harbours in Arbroath or whatever else. Alex Salmond comes up with wonderful ideas, and money has to be found for it. And that money has been coming from the classroom. It's been coming from the number of teachers. It's been coming from school books. It's been coming, I would argue, from student bursaries. It's been coming from a whole range of sources that this government has actually not been able to deliver on. They made promises and they have systematically and cynically broken them. We will not do that.
Thank you. Questions now for Elizabeth Smith of the Scottish Conservative Party. And can I ask Angela from the SNP for our first question for Liz?
Thank you. The Tories make a lot of their plans to emulate the Swedish model and to introduce free schools run by private companies. But Sweden is actually behind Scotland in the international league tables of educational performance, in contrast to Finland, who have a curriculum very similar to the new curriculum for excellence. And I'm interested as to why the Tories wish to emulate a country that performs worse than Scotland instead of one that actually tops the league tables.
Well, can we be clear? It's not true that we're above Sweden in all things. In fact, far from it. Yes, there are some areas where Scotland is a little better, and I think our teacher training model, if I'm not mistaken, is something that is valued in Sweden. The reason we were very taken with Sweden and with Finland, indeed with Netherlands and with Denmark, is because of the additional choice that is in their system, and not just the fact that the new schools that developed improved, but so did the existing ones in the system. That is a huge attraction for us, that because of the element of choice and because parents have a greater say in where they'd like their children to be educated, that has driven up standards in the existing schools. And I think the evidence from Sweden particularly is pretty comprehensive in that.
Thank you. A question from Des McNulty.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth, I think the Conservatives' last debate in the Parliament was on early education. It was actually quite a consensual debate, and we certainly agreed with a number of the points that your party was making, and indeed other parties were making, both about need to really improve universal provision for children, early education and care. You make the point about nurses and health visitors. We would make the point about education as well. But there's also an issue, it seems to me, about targeting resources towards those children and those families that are most vulnerable. Do the Conservatives accept that, as well as improving universal provision, we need to focus on targeted provision? And what kinds of targeted provision would you like to see?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, can I just answer the two parts to that? Firstly, the reason we want universal health care is that every child, and it doesn't matter from what background they come, every child between birth and 5 has health issues of some sort. They may have no particular problems, but nonetheless it is very important that they and their families get help and are regularly seen. And I think that applies right across the board. And in fact, I think a lot of parents like to feel that that system is universal. When it comes to targeting, you're quite right, there are specific cases. One of the reasons we want to target more places in nursery school for 2-year-olds is for that very reason, that we feel that there are some children who would greatly benefit from that. We chose a targeted approach when it came to the school meals vote as well. We didn't feel that it was appropriate to have that right across the board, especially from families who could well afford to pay for that. So I think you're right, I think there is a mix, and I hope our policies reflect that.
Thank you. And finally, for the Scottish Tory candidate, Margaret.
I wanted to pick up again on the issue of the sort of structure of schools. And Education Committee's done some work in the last few weeks asking people what they thought about this. Very useful discussions. There didn't really seem to be a great number of people following your lead, Liz, in terms of the structure and wanting free schools and support that kind of way forward. And you've said that what you wanted to see is an element of choice, and you've named some countries. I would guess that all of those countries probably have a tax take which is significantly higher, certainly some of them, than Scotland's. How would you pay for those choices, and how would you go about persuading the vast majority of people in the educational field in Scotland that actually there does need to be structural change, and what are we going to get out of it?
Well, I think that the driving force for me is that since 1999, the education spend, the school spending since devolution has doubled. But we haven't seen the requisite improvement in attainment. Now, we've been doing very well. Don't get me wrong, there are certain very good things happening in Scottish education, but the overall attainment level is not as good as it should be. And that sends a message. Why is that? Why have we put so much extra money in? Why are we not getting better results? And if you listen to what parents are saying, quite rightly, they all want a good local state school on their doorstep. Now, sadly, in too many cases, that's not the case. And there is very little incentive that I can see just now for some of these schools to improve, because they're at the behest of a one-size-fits-all system. Policies, direction of education from the council is a one-size-fits-all in many authorities, and I think that takes in huge geographical areas with differences. I don't think it's right that a school that is in a rural community has identical education policies to one in a city. I just don't accept that. And I don't think parents accept that. And I think what parents are looking for is the facility to have more choice about where they send their child to reflect the needs, the individual needs of that child. And that's why we're interested in some of the other countries. In some cases, you're right, they have a higher tax base, but in other countries that's not the case, very definitely not. But we're interested in that extra choice.
Thank you. And finally, facing questions from her opponents, Margaret Smith of the Scottish Liberal Democrats. First question, please, from Elizabeth from the Tories.
Margaret, could I just ask about the announcement at the weekend from the Liberals that it's going to be taking away some of the free bus passes to pay for higher education? Can you just give us your arithmetic on that basis?
Well, I think where we're coming from is that we've made a decision to effectively keep the position that we've had throughout the decade or so of devolution in terms of student support and in terms of higher education and how it should be funded. But I don't think anybody can run away from the fact that we've got some difficult choices to be made. I think there will have to be some difficult choices in terms of plugging that gap. Now, some of it will probably come from fees from rest of the United Kingdom students, but we will have to look at some of the other things that we're spending money on at the time. And somebody said already there's been choices made by the SNP that we wouldn't have made. We wouldn't have allowed, for example, the choice in terms of free school meals to families who can afford it. So it is all about choices. And as we've got the figures now a little bit clearer in front of us over the last week or so, we'll start to look at some of these and actually then in our manifesto come forward with fully costed proposals in terms of how we're actually going to plug that gap. And I think what Tavish was saying was that actually if we are committed to plugging that gap in terms of higher education funding, we have to be prepared to look across the board and find ways in which we can actually raise that. And everything that politicians say on this issue has to, at its heart, not only be philosophically right, but it has to be credible financially.
And a question from Angela.
Thank you. The SNP has explicitly ruled out ever going into coalition with the Tories. Given that the Liberals let the Tories into power in England by going into coalition, will the Liberal Democrats commit to never doing the same in Scotland? And if so, can we believe you?
Well, I'm a very optimistic person, as you know, Angela. I'm a very optimistic politician. I'm not so overly optimistic that I actually think that Liz and I are going to suddenly find ourselves together running the government of Scotland the next time round. So I don't think it's really something that's particularly on the cards. We've had a coalition. We've been involved in a coalition in Scotland for 8 years. We've then had a minority government from the SNP, and I hope we've been a responsible opposition. We certainly supported the last Scottish Government budget because we were able to put together a plan in terms of greater funding for colleges and college bursaries. So I think that we are prepared to work with people when we think that actually what they want, what we want, is basically on the same agenda. And I think it would always be the way forward that the largest party has, if you like, the moral right to try to form a government. But then people have to talk about what they're actually going to deliver. I'm less interested in coalitions and less interested in ministerial positions and more interested in actually what are we going to do for Scotland.
Thank you, Margaret. And finally, in this round, Des McNulty.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Margaret, part of the area I represent is represented by Joe Swinson, MP, who voted for the Conservative Lib Dem proposals to put tuition fees up to £9,000 in England. I understand Tavish Scott has a different policy in Scotland. What policy does Danny Alexander have?
Well, this is about the elections to the Scottish Parliament, and the last time I looked, Danny Alexander wasn't either an MSP or trying to be an MSP. My MP colleague voted against the rise down south for what it's worth. And I think what's more important is to remind people of the record of the Scottish Liberal Democrats in the Scottish Parliament. This is a devolved matter. We scrapped the tuition fees that had been brought in by your party. Meanwhile, your colleagues who continued to be Scottish MPs serving in the Westminster government then increased those tuition fees, every single one of them. There was no split. None of them paired off. They all went and voted for that increase despite the fact they had a manifesto commitment that said that they wouldn't. I think what's more important to people now is to say, what are people in Scotland who are going to be elected to that Parliament next time round going to say? And actually, more importantly, what are they going to do? And what we're about is trying to make ways in which we can actually keep higher education competitive and have a fair student support system. We've said that we do not think that means having anything to do with tuition fees, and it doesn't have anything to do with a graduate contribution either. I think we've been absolutely and utterly clear on that, and it builds on our experience in government, our experience in opposition, and the position we've taken in Scotland for the last 12 years in the Scottish Parliament. And I've been very proud to be part of that.
Thank you, Margaret. Next section now, we've having unleashed the politicians on each other, we're now going to unleash the audience on the politicians, both here in the hall and also at home over the internet. Can I have a first question from the audience, please? Is that lady here? Hold on, could you just sorry? Can you wait until you get a microphone and say who you are, so that everyone knows who you are? Sorry, can I also ask that the questions are kept quite tight, and that the answers are kept even tighter. That we will get as many questions as we can in before the end. Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Etty Spencer. I'm a parent, actually, of 6 children. I have my 2 youngest are still in high school. I've watched over a period of 2 decades a very marked depletion in resources and scope in schools. And I think the curriculum now seems to be much more heavily restricted. I've talked to teachers who said they're frustrated by it. I'm also a part-time lecturer in fine art, and I've experienced first-year students arriving from school less and less able, as I see it, to think outside the box. I think the curriculum and the scope of what they learn in school has become not exactly dumbed down, but much less imaginative, and there's less and less freedom for teachers to use their imagination. Would people like to comment?
Can I ask that your replies to that focus on this issue of soft skills? It seems to be one that is maybe underplayed in debate, but it's on a lot of people's concerns about the people who are going for interview, not being able to kind of conduct themselves properly, the soft skills that people need to conduct business. Angela.
Thank you. I actually don't believe there's such a thing as soft skills. People sometimes talk about lower skills and higher level skills. I mean, skills in terms of core communication skills are what you need for everyday life. And I don't think I agree with the point that over the past few decades resources have diminished. I mean, I visited this morning the high school that I attended, and I can assure you it is nothing like the school that I left more than 20 years ago. And all I would say to Betty is, the whole drive of Curriculum for Excellence is about freeing up teachers, so that they're not curtailed unnecessarily by, the disciplines that they teach.
Des, do you have a comment on this?
I mean, one of the things that we think we need to pay particular attention to is literacy and numeracy. We think that there are that not being able to read, write, and count properly is a huge barrier for individuals who don't learn those things at school, which is why we've identified it as really our top priority in terms of taking forward the education agenda. I think Curriculum for Excellence will loosen off some of the rigidity that's there within the current exam systems. But there is a balance, if you like, between teaching soft skills and subject rigour, and we need to get that right. And I'm not sure that the way in which Curriculum for Excellence has been implemented thus far has actually given sufficient clarity to teachers, or indeed to parents, about how this is going to be done. We're signing up to a kind of concept which I think everybody would broadly agree with, but the substance that needs to lie behind it I don't think is there yet, and it's certainly something I would hold this government responsible for.
Liz.
I broadly agree with that, and I think you make a very good point about the imagination and the creativity which is required. That can only come if children not only have the requisite skills, but they actually have the fundamental knowledge that goes with each subject. And my concern just now about the Curriculum for Excellence, which I support in its basic principles, is that the discrete knowledge that is required is a bit hazy in certain areas. I think that's a real problem, and I think it's a real concern for teachers. I think you also make a very valid point about the other skills that are required for the workplace. I'll give a plug for Scotland on Sunday. In your article yesterday, you wrote about an article about that and how that is sadly missing in too many youngsters, and I think we need to take that on board.
Margaret.
Yeah, picking up on that last point about the kinds of skills that people need in the workplace. I mean, education is not just about employability, but it's very, very important, and it's probably more important at the moment than it's ever been. So I think, yes, people need soft skills, but they also need to know what is required of them going into a workplace. And I think Scotland's colleges have been particularly good at this. That's one of the areas of concern I have at the moment, is that there's a rollback from some of the funding going into schools-college partnerships, which have actually worked very well for some of the kids who are maybe switched off a little bit more halfway through their secondary school. And I think it's really, really important that we keep people engaged, whether that's in school, whether that's in a college situation. But I do think that the soft skills are very, very important. And we do sign up to Curriculum for Excellence, but there does need to be further clarity for teachers to give them the confidence to free them up, and also through that to free up pupils and to give them the chance to explore the creativity and innovation.
Thank you. We've been watched on the internet as we speak, and we have people sending in questions. One via the live chat from someone called Ron, and I'll put this to you guys. And if we can keep it nice and tight, it'd be grateful we'll get more in. How can we help teachers who are feeling constrained by the red tape in the classroom and also by disruptive pupils? Perhaps Des, do you want to address that one first?
Well, I think we need to look at the paperwork, the amount of paperwork that teachers have to fill in, which is not just associated with Curriculum for Excellence, but Curriculum for Excellence potentially is racking this up. And I think I'm a believer that we need to look and see what kind of record keeping we have within schools, how much of it is simply duplication of information that we've already got, and how we can make it accessible. In terms of disruption, I think it's actually about setting standards of behaviour within the school and working with parents to enforce and maintain those standards. I think far too many young people's education is disrupted by fellow pupils who don't want to learn, and we've actually got to find a way of motivating all our young people and also getting some authority back to the teacher and to the school to actually make sure that this low level of disruption doesn't actually adversely affect young people's education.
Liz.
the professional standards of teachers are improving all the time. That's thanks to an awful lot of good work that's been done by the GTC, by the teacher training colleges. But I also think Graham Donaldson, in his recent review, has got a lot to say about that, and I think that will enhance the professional standards. When it comes to indiscipline, quite frankly, I think there's absolutely no excuse whatsoever for a very small minority, but nonetheless highly disruptive pupils still being in mainstream classrooms if they have been persistently excluded. I would like to see these pupils out into a second chance centre where they have got a little bit of help to refocus their lives.
Margaret.
Well, I think my earlier comment about trying to engage people, certainly throughout secondary school, is important here, because I think it's those kind of kids that switch off and then can end up finding themselves being disruptive to others. I think Liz is right. We do actually need to give options to head teachers so that people can be excluded without them actually being excluded from education and from assistance, because that actually doesn't do any of us any good. I think the quality of our teachers absolutely central in terms of dealing with this issue as well. And in terms of red tape and so on, again, I think what we want to see through Curriculum for Excellence is obviously the ongoing assessment by teachers that's done all the time, but without overburdening that down into always having to have, you know, lots and lots and lots of paperwork being done. Free up the teachers to teach and to concentrate on learning and teaching, and take a little bit back in terms of the time they spend filling in forms.
Okay. Finally, Angela.
Well, as a former social worker who used to have to write our case notes in triplicate, I have every sympathy with the questioner and the need in a variety of public sector settings to roll back bureaucracy. But I think that the crucial component of Curriculum for Excellence is actually about giving back professional autonomy to teachers. And as a former social worker who all my career craved more professional autonomy, I do hope that that's something that the teaching profession will grasp. It is important to recognise that exclusions in Scotland's schools are down, and like Liz, I think the Donaldson Review did have a lot of interesting things to say on that subject, and the need to seriously look at initial teacher training and what can and can't be realistically taught, and on what needs to be followed up by continuous professional development. And of course, with regards to indiscipline and bullying, we do need to keep up with the times and the technology, and we need to focus our minds on issues to do with cyberbullying, etc.
Thank you. Gentleman here, have you got there?
James Fraser, Principal of the University of the Highlands and Islands. Our innovatory delivery system attracts a very high proportion of part-time students. 55% of our students are part-time. Yet part-time students attract less financial support than full-time students. Will the next Scottish Government rectify this anomaly?
One for Elizabeth, first of all.
Begs the question, will I be in government after the election? Maybe a coalition. Who knows? Who knows? I think you raise a very important point, and can I just say congratulations to the University of the Highlands and Islands. I think you've done terrific work, and particularly because it is a slightly different mix of student, and it's expanded learning into areas that previously have not been there. One of the reasons we believe that both for FE and for HE, there needs to be, in our opinion, about 15% extra money in the system than is currently there, is so that we can do something about supporting this. Obviously, some of these people are paying fees already, but a great number are not. If we're going to provide more support, and we're also going to allow greater access into that kind of learning, we have to find more money, and that's the basic reason why we believe that there has to be a graduate contribution.
Thank you. Margaret?
Well, thank you very much for the question, and thank you also for all that you've done in terms of showing people the way forward in terms of innovation in further and higher education. And I think your question is well made in the sense of the diversity of Scotland's students. I think we all still have this mindset that it's an 18-year-old coming out of school, going to university, when in actual fact the diversity of Scotland's students is very, very different indeed. One thing I would say about the solution that they've come up with down south, which I might not want to support all of it, but one of the interesting things in the midst of all of that is that actually they've found a way of actually giving greater support to part-time students. And I think that is something that we should actually be trying to find a way to do that in Scotland. We're certainly very relaxed about the possibility of having a review of student support post-election. Not the full-scale review that Des McNulty was talking about, looking at higher education funding overall, because we actually think that work's been done, and we think there's actually an urgent need to get on now and make that funding case and get that funding in place to keep HE competitive. But in terms of student support, this is a very, very complex issue. We've got people wondering whether or not they can actually afford to go to college, whether or not they'll get the childcare that they need to go to college, people trying to make choices about reskilling and retraining and so on, and actually not really knowing whether or not they can afford to do that. So I think there is a need for a review of student support. I think Scotland students should be absolutely full scale at the heart of that. That's something we would probably want to do, and I think your point about part-time students is well made, because what we actually need is an HE system which has the flexibility built into it to allow people to learn at their pace and in their own way, rather than straitjacketing everybody into something that just happens to suit university principles.
Angela, your thoughts?
I think it's important to recognise that the current Scottish Government has actually increased student bursaries and grants, and this has been to the benefit of some part-time students. But notwithstanding the Government's endeavours successfully to get more young people into full-time learning, I think that the demographics of the student population, looking ahead, we are going to see increasing numbers of part-time students, and as ever we need to be vigilant to issues of equity of access.
I'd love to take more questions, but unfortunately we're badly overrunning on time, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to move to the last section. Did you not get a chance to answer that one, Des? No, you should. Yeah, sorry. Carry on.
I think I taught for 20 years in higher education, and a lot of the students I taught were actually part-time students rather than being all full-time students. And I think the way forward in higher education is actually going to involve more part-time students, more distance learning, more flexible provision, people dotting in and out of higher education at different points in their career. And we have to adapt higher education to meet those requirements. That's why, to some extent, I think we need a review of higher education, not, as Margaret said, a review of higher education funding. I think funding has, to some extent, been done to death. But I think we need to decide what kind of higher education we want to see, how we make it more flexible, how we make it more adaptable, how we're not driven by the past in quite the way that I think we have been. And I think more open to different methods of learning, because that's what's going to be needed in the future. We have to make education as flexible as educational technology is becoming, and that is revolutionising itself every few years. We have to make higher education a much more fleet-footed system than it is at the present time.
Okay, as I say, time is of the essence, so can we move on to the summings up? Each of our four politicians in front of you has 2 minutes to sum up their arguments. And first of all, Angela Constance for the SNP.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it is clear to everybody here that we are currently living in very difficult times, both financially and economically. The Scottish Government has had 1.3 billion chopped from its budget. But it is important that in terms of Scotland and Scotland's education that we actually stop talking Scotland down, and that we should recognise that we do have lower class sizes than ever before. By the end of this term there will be 330 new school projects taking thousands of Scotland's children out of substandard schools. And inevitably much of the discussion has focused around higher education, and I suppose I would put to people here today that really only the SNP can be trusted with higher education policy, given the flip-flops we've seen from the Labour Party on pay policy, restraint or not, NHS funding to ring-fence or not, council tax to freeze or not. And I think it's interesting that the Labour Party for 12 years have been in favour of things like tuition fees, but only in the last 3 days are in favour of free education. But of course the debate about Scotland's education is about more than universities. At the heart of our economic recovery plan is Scotland's colleges, and it's the SNP that are investing in additional modern apprenticeships, 25,000 per annum, 25,000 per annum additional training places, and the budget just passed by Parliament has seen record investment into things like student bursaries, an additional £15 million, which was agreed collectively by the Parliament. But of course, the Labour Party voted against additional college places and voted against record investment in modern apprentices by voting against the Scottish budget.
Thank you. Des.
Amongst the things the Labour Party voted against were 8% cuts in higher education, 10.4% cuts in further education, and very substantial cuts in the money going to local government, which feeds through into schools. The reality is that over the last 3 years, the amount of money the Scottish Government has got from Westminster has actually increased year by year, but the amount or the proportion going into education has reduced. That's a matter of political choice. The SNP had choices to make, and they chose not to put money into education. And you can see that in terms of the numbers of teachers and all the other problems that education currently faces. We want to make different choices. And the choices we want to make, I think, are about putting more teachers into schools, about focusing on excellence within schools, getting schools to be more ambitious and more dynamic, a bit more diversity within the system. We actually want to focus on those young people who want to pursue vocational subjects, which, as Margaret Smith said, are actually being disadvantaged at the present time because of the cuts in schools, college funding, and the abolition of Determined to Succeed. These are some of the young people who could succeed and are not being given the opportunity to succeed as a result of the deliberate choices made by the SNP. As I say, we want to do different things. We believe in education. We believe education must be a priority for Scotland. We've got a series of very concrete and